The Ivory God by J.S. Fletcher. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Rowdy Delaney, Idaho, USA, September 2007. The Ivory God by J.S. Fletcher. At 6 o'clock, Thurston put down his pen, pushed back his chair from the table at which he had been writing, and rose to his feet with a series of gestures indicative of mental and physical fatigue. He glanced at the few sheets of manuscript which represented the result of a long day's labor, and he frowned, as if in anger or distaste. He had written, or tried to write, from 10 o'clock until 1, and again from 2 until 6, and his entire product after 7 hours' work was comparatively infinitesimal. He felt no enthusiasm. He had been unable to concentrate his thoughts. The whole thing had been distasteful to him. As he glanced around, he asked himself for the thousandth time whether the game was worth the candle. More from force of habit than from genuine desire to do it, Thurston proceeded to make some sort of toilette for the evening. He shaved and washed carefully, put on a clean linen shirt and a dark lounge suit. He was unduly practical about the fold of his tie. In several small ways he showed that he had a gentlemanlike love of cleanliness and orderly habits. He did everything slowly. It would have been evident to anyone who might have had an opportunity of watching him that he had no engagement to keep. In point of fact, he had few friends with whom he could keep any engagement. He was, as he now never cared to remind himself, one of the very loneliest men living. For a while he had reminded himself of this pertinent truth somewhat often. Then he wearied of the thought and put it from him. The fact of the loneliness, however, remained. Thurston lived in 2 rooms at the top of a house which stood in a quiet street near the British Museum, a street of an aspect so grey and pathetic that you wondered at first sight of it whether laughter or children's voices were ever heard there. The 2 rooms opened one into another by means of a folding door. Thurston had furnished them himself when he first came to town. One room contained a camp bedstead, a chest of drawers, a dressing table, a washstand, a bath, and a hard-bottomed chair. The floor was stained and polished, and destitute of carpet, but there was a thick bearskin rug at the bedside. It was absolutely destitute of luxuries or of pictures, but it possessed a first-rate reading lamp attached to the wall at the head of the bed. The other room knew the luxury of books. Its walls were covered with them to half their height. The books related chiefly to philosophy, theology, history, metaphysics. There was little that was light, but a table was strewn with the reviews of several countries, all purchased second hand and a month old. A desk, littered with papers, stood near the window. An armchair was placed near the hearth. 2 other chairs, of an easyish sort, occurred sometimes here, sometimes there. A small table, big enough for one person to eat at, was in the middle of the room, which, unlike the sleeping chamber, was softly carpeted and luxuriant in thick rugs. It also possessed some luxuries in the way of pictures, but these, to the English eye of ordinary knowledge, were of a strange taste, being Japanese. One skilled in such matters might have told you that they were all by the most celebrated Japanese artists. Even then, you would have felt some uneasiness at the prospect of being continually shut up in a room whose decorations were so purely Eastern. In these 2 rooms Thurston had spent 5 years, every day corresponding to another day. He prepared his breakfast when he wished for it. He read or wrote when he desired to do so. He lunched and dined out. He spent his evenings reading or thinking or dreaming. It was a strange life altogether, but it was his. But then, the few people who knew Thurston said he was a strange man, a man who spoke little, laughed never, smiled seldom, and who was quite young in spite of everything. In point of fact, he was 27 years old. At 22 he had left Oxford with some reputation as a scholar and a mystic, and had come to town with the set purpose of following a literary career. Whether he had any ambitions at that time is a debatable question. It is quite certain that at 27 none of them had been carried out. He had a little money of his own, sufficient to pay his rent, his housekeeping expenses, his tailor's bills, and so on, and there was, therefore, no need to keep his nose to the grindstone. But he had made no name. He sometimes exhibited a rather heavy, rather pedantic, rather wearisome sort of article to one or the other of the leading reviews, the sort of article which is spoken of with great respect by the critics and read by only a few experts, but to the general public he was as unknown as an unborn babe. The people who had any dealings with him said he was unsociable. He had no conversation. If by any chance he was induced to lunch or dine with you, his sole notion seemed to be to get away as quickly as possible. It was evident that he was one of those men who like to be alone. There were times, however, when Thurston felt his loneliness, and one of them was hanging heavily about him on this particular evening. He had found it difficult to write during the day, and more than once he had caught himself wishing that a friend would come by to break the solitude. But he would have been hard put to it to say where such a friend was to be found. He never encouraged anyone to visit him at his rooms. One or two men, old college acquaintances, had tracked him down and called upon him, but quickly discovered that they were not wanted. It was not that Thurston wished to be rude. It was simply that a certain shyness and loneliness ran in his blood and his temperament, and made him incapable of entertaining his fellow creatures. He was essentially an anchorite, and yet there were times when his flesh called for something which it would have found it hard to define in words. As Thurston drew on his overcoat, a light tap came at his door. He went across and opened it, not without some feeling of surprise that anyone should be there. In the faint light at the top of the landing he saw a man whom he did not recognize, a tall, sloping shouldered man, whose back was somewhat bowed, whose knees bent in, a man who made a succession of angles in his clothes. Thurston could see that he was shabbily attired, that his hair was long, greasy, and unclean. He had a vague notion that an unwashed atmosphere hung heavily all around and about his visitor. He held the door half open, staring at the man. The man blinked at him. "Mr. Thurston?" he said inquiringly. "Well?" replied Thurston. The man sighed heavily. "I was sent to you, sir, by Mr. Evanson. I have something to show you which he thought you might like to see. He thought you might not be indisposed to buy it from me. May I come in and show it to you, Mr. Thurston?" said the man, indicating a small package which he carried in the crook of one arm. "I am not disposed to buy anything," answered Thurston, keeping his place. "But this, sir, is something very uncommon. It is seldom that any collector has such a chance of securing such a valuable curiosity," urged the visitor. "At any rate, it will do you no harm to look at it, Mr. Thurston." "Well," said Thurston, impassively and hesitatingly, "you may bring it in, then, but I really don't want to see it, and I shan't buy it, whatever it may be." He turned away and made preparations for lighting a lamp. The man with the parcel lingered at the threshold until the lamp had been placed on the center table, and the apartment was bathed in clear, powerful light. "Now then," said Thurston, still impassive as ever, "come forward. Let me see what it is. Mr. Evans has no business to send you to me. I'm merely an acquaintance of his, and I'm certainly not a collector. What is it you have to show me?" The untidy, unwashed person took small notice of this impatient outburst. He advanced to the table, placed the parcel near the lamp, and proceeded to divest it of its wrappings. He kept himself between Thurston and the parcel while this was going on, and he did not speak until suddenly he turned round and said with a note of pride and triumph in his voice: "There, Mr. Thurston, look at that!" Thurston, during the unfolding of the parcel, had fallen into a sort of daydream. He came out of it with a start, and looked at the object which his visitor had placed on the table in the full light of the lamp. A sudden gleam came into his rather dull eyes. A sudden exclamation burst from his lips. "Ah!" he said. The man smiled and rubbed his hands. He chuckled. "I thought that would move you, Mr. Thurston," he said. "It's a beauty, isn't it?" Thurston made no answer to this. He advanced to the table and stood at its edge, contemplating the thing which his visitor had been so anxious to exhibit. He found himself staring at an